Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and today I'm going to talk about tin helmets in World War One. The reason for choosing this topic is the fact that PPE, personal protective equipment, is in the news at the moment, and I always find it fascinating that when the Great War, the First World War, started in 1914, no British soldiers had helmets to wear. They were actually wearing cloth caps. If you go back a little bit earlier in history, we did have, for example, the home service helmets that were generally cork covered in cloth, usually with a spike on the top. And that was a standard helmet for the British soldier for a long period of time. Interesting fact, when we went to war, the Great War that is, we started to wear the flat cap. And interestingly, our service helmets, these spiked helmets, these fine helmets, were actually placed back in Britain, really. Interesting fact also, when the Germans went to war, they were wearing the pickle helm, which has a spike on. So as I always say, when the war broke out, Britain left their spiked helmets back in Britain. The Germans took theirs to war. However, for the early part of the war, it was very much a mobile war. So at first they wanted to keep the battles moving, so there was a lot of firing from field to field using canals and things like that. But then sadly, with the amount of firepower, be it artillery and also machine gun and rifle fire, slowly soldiers started to dig in the ground. And as we all know, you've only got to hear a loud bang or something like that, we naturally duck, and therefore soldiers started to dig into the ground. And at first they dug very shallow little ditches, and then slowly these ditches all connected to each other to form what we now know from the Great War, trench warfare. Trench warfare is an interesting topic in its own right. We have had trenches before. Think about the English Civil War, siege trenches, the Crimea Wars, the same thing, trench warfare. But really, there had been a long period where we hadn't relied on going underground. So really, we had to retrain ourselves to this way of thinking. And when you are under the ground, when you are in these trenches, the enemy, just like ourselves, will always develop new weapons to hit people and kill people that are below ground. It's actually one of the reasons why gas was invented, so it would drift across no man's land and pour into the ground, into the actual trenches. It's the same reason why hand grenades were redeveloped, because you have to remember hand grenades have been around way back in history. You even had medieval fire pots and even the Grenados in the Civil War. So we have a new way of warfare, and sadly, statistically, a lot of British soldiers were suffering from head injuries, and that's really down to the fact they're in the ground, and as we all know, what goes up must come down. So what I've got for you, first of all, is this helmet here. So when did this actually appear? Well, this is the Brody Helmet, and the interesting thing is it was patented in 1915, so a year into the war. It was very slow getting to the troops, which is why you do see a lot of photographs and images of soldiers in the First World War not wearing them in these early years, the early months of the war. Eventually they were given to people on guard duty, so they were very much a specialist thing. When someone's on guard duty, they put the tin helmet on and it's shared. But then eventually, by the end of 1915 and definitely into 1916, these were standard issue. And they are interesting because when you look at the shape of them, we looked at history. Britain looked at history and thought we need a helmet that protects the head. And we look back, and this very much resembles a medieval kettle helmet. The reason why the medieval period had kettle helmets were, or the reason why they were called kettle helmets, was down to the fact that the kettle helmet was meant to represent a kettle, the sort of thing that you boil water in, the cauldron as we call it later in history. So it looks like you're wearing a cooking pot on your head. So medieval people would have worn some sort of protection, and Brody looked at these old designs and went, we could use these in the trenches across the world. And you have to remember that the Great War is a international conflict, so we've got troops serving across in Mesopotamia, including the Western Front, which is what everyone always talks about. So these do protect the head. They're not designed to protect the sides of the head or anything like that. These are purely for trench warfare. Things going up, comes down and lands on the top of your head. The rim protecting anything coming down towards the face or neck. Very simple helmet, really. When you look at what the Germans had developed, they actually developed a helmet which came lower down on the neck, the standard German shape that we all know, the iconic shape. So these helmets started to be used en masse by 1916. Now, these are purely for the soldiers that are fighting in the trenches, and also some of the other troops that are around during the Great War. However, as trench warfare developed, we also get the introduction of the tank. And interestingly, they developed a separate piece of personal protective equipment, PPE, for tank crews. And I've got a copy, a replica one, just of here. This is the helmet that was designed for tank crews. And these are made of leather, and they're made of leather, so they're pretty lightweight. And the inside of them keeps your head away from the leather. So the strapping in here leaves a gap between the leather outer and your head inside. And these are designed more like a bump helmet, because the problem in the tanks is the tank crews were often shook around quite a lot, and there was a lot to bump your heads on, just like there was a lot to burn your hands on inside a tank. So the idea is you put this on, and if the tank rocks from side to side, you could very easily have your head protected as it bumps against the inside of the tank. Now, there were problems in tanks, as we all know, and that's a subject of another talk, shall we say. But tank crews sometimes found that when the tanks broke down, and they often did, especially in the early stages of the tank warfare in 1915, 1916, tank crews often ended up outside the tank. They often had to escape from their tank and get back to their own lines. And the problem is, some of them, whilst wearing these helmets, were mistaken as being German. And if you look at it, soldiers knew that at night or in low light, that is a British soldier. It's the standard Tommy helmet. It's obvious. But the problem is, wearing one of these as a member of the tank crew do actually make you look, if you can imagine low light levels, maybe in fog or even smoke, it does actually look a bit German. So these interesting helmets were very short-lived. They were worn by tank crews to start with, and then a lot of them actually took up basically the standard helmet of the day, because this was more obvious to anyone on the battlefield as being a British soldier. An interesting thing about these tank helmets, by the way, is they were often worn with a mask. And I don't just own this helmet here, I also have a mask for you. And these are very strange objects. So like I said, at the moment in the news, we're talking about personal protective equipment, the masks, the goggles and so on. This is what the tank crews had in the Great War. The reason why they wore this very strange, almost medieval type of mask is the fact that inside the tank, when bullets and all sorts of rubbish hit the outside of the tank, you often had small fragments of metal, all sorts of paint chipping off. And the problem is the tank crews often got damage to their eyes, to their face, and therefore they started wearing these masks. And the idea is the goggles, the metal goggles, is designed to stop things going into the eye. And the chainmail, this old-fashioned form of armour, mail that goes right back in history, even the Celts were using it, is designed to protect the face, the mouth in particular, the nose, and so on. So I find personal protective equipment really interesting. I have a large collection of it. I don't, unfortunately, have modern personal protective equipment. In other words, I don't have the masks, the goggles, which the NHS needs at the moment. But what I do have is a vast selection of armour. And like I've said before, military history is an interest of mine. So as you can imagine, in my store, I have all sorts of things. Name a helmet from any period in history. Yes, I do have one. I find it a fascinating subject, and hopefully this has given you a little incentive to go out and look up the tank crews of the Great War, the helmets that were worn, and always amazing, these were not worn at the start of the war. We went to war in cloth caps. Peak caps that look smart on the parade ground but pretty useless in battle. Anyway, as we always say, stay safe, stay home, and we'll see you soon. Bye bye.